This talk, as you probably know, is about Azure. Now, the title suggests that it's for IT leaders. Let me ask, who here is not an IT leader? Right, that's okay, you can still stay. Right? It's designed for a broad audience. The point is, I want to help you understand how and why people adopt Azure. And so, my big contention here, my assertion, the foundation of this talk is this. It is that I believe that nearly every enterprise today can benefit from using a public cloud platform. I believe that, and I will, in the next hour or so, explain why. Okay? Let's start. So what the heck is a public cloud platform? Well, Azure is an example of a public cloud platform. Microsoft's an example. There are others, certainly. This is a new market with several vendors. Only a few matter. We'll discuss that later on. It looks like this. Azure provides computing resources, computers, storage, and so on, in data centers around the world. The picture's like that. There are right now several US data centers, a couple in Europe, a bunch in Asia, some in Australia, some in South America, and there are more all the time. So that's the idea. You take your data, you take your apps, you run them in computer systems over Microsoft, scattered around the world. All right, so your first thought is this. Wait a minute, you're thinking, David, are you nuts? Are you out of your mind? The first question everybody has when they hear about this is the following. It is, can a public cloud platform like Azure keep my data applications safe? That's everyone's first question. Here's the deal. People think this is a security issue. They think, how can they have security? And you think that because in your own environment, you or someone in your group controls the data center. It's your job to check things like firewall settings, to make sure the last admin you hired is actually a trustworthy person. That is your job when you have your own data center. With public cloud platforms, you can't do that. Microsoft will take you on a tour of their data center. It's pretty cool, I'm told. I've not done it. But you walk through, Microsoft will say, look, over there, servers. Look, over there, more servers. They will not let you check the firewall settings or read the resume of the last guy they hired. No, no, no. You can't do that stuff. You simply have to trust them. You have to learn to trust your public cloud provider, e.g., Microsoft. How do we do this? How do you build trust? The answer in almost every situation is you build trust slowly. You start small, do something small. Is there benefit there? Yeah. Was there risk? Maybe. I feel better now. Let's try something bigger and go on from there. That's how people build trust. And so, in this talk, I'm going to walk through a bunch of Azure scenarios, and you will see the adoption that I commonly see is based primarily on trust. Microsoft, I suspect, would love you to, next week, start a big program to move all your apps to Azure. No one does that at the beginning. Almost no one. Instead, you build trust slowly and make the change over time. And let me tell you, I believe that you will make the change. I believe that the future of data centers has a large part in the cloud. Not everything, but a large part in the cloud. However, you're going to start slowly for most of you. And I'll show you what that means in a few minutes. But you know, here's the thing. People are just so deeply irrational about trust. I've had CIOs say to me, David, I would never put my critical business data in this public cloud. Never, never, never. Then they send me important information via Dropbox, which runs on Amazon, a competitor, right? People are irrational. Or here's my favorite example. Ask yourself this. What is the world's scariest technology? What is the world's most dangerous technology? Is it nuclear weapons? Is it some computer virus that's going to destroy all our systems? No. No. The world's scariest and most dangerous technology is Windows Update. And you know why? It's because every Patch Tuesday, Microsoft puts right in your operating systems whatever code it feels like. And you say, install. How do you know? The last update or the next one doesn't contain code that steals all your data. How do you know? Answer, you don't. You just trust Microsoft. Now think about that. The level of control they have by putting code right in your operating system is extraordinary. Imagine that tonight it was announced that all of Microsoft was purchased by the government of North Korea. Right? Unlikely, I know. But wouldn't you turn off Windows Update? I sure would. I hope you would too. My point here is the level of trust we have in Microsoft is so great, I would suggest it far exceeds what Azure asks of you. So, I believe we're headed for a world where when I say Azure is a dangerous technology, people will laugh, as you just did, about Windows Update. Windows Update is truly powerful. The risk is greater than this, I would suggest. So, I'll discuss how you can walk slowly into this and build some trust. But even this question is not the end. Once you start to feel trusting, a little bit of comfort here, they always ask this. They always think, what about compliance? What about my requirement to meet the laws that apply to me about data? Does that work in the cloud? And the answer is, well, it's more complicated. You must understand the rules that apply to you, and that can be hard, partly because those rules and regulations were created before the cloud era. And so we're seeing efforts, say in Europe, to harmonize these. That's good. But more than that, there's this challenge. The challenge is this. The rules differ across different vertical markets, financial services, healthcare, retail, and government, and so on. And they differ across countries. Anybody here who's not from the U.S.? Not U.S.? A lot of you. Right, right. So you know, what you wind up with here is a matrix of rules and regulations that probably no one in the whole world really understands. But that's what you got to follow. How do you do this? Well, I'll show you. People often start with Azure technologies that have very low risk because they don't use regulated data. Okay? That's one thing. Also, a surprising number of people just ignore this. You guys probably use OneDrive or Dropbox in your companies, yes? Everyone does, it seems. When people put a Word document containing sensitive information on OneDrive, the users all think, gee, did I just break the law? They might have, if there's certain kinds of data in that Word document. People just don't think about this. I am not recommending you ignore the laws. Just pointing out the reality of how things work today. It is my experience, however, that when organizations actually walk down the path, get their lawyers involved if they need to, and check how much they can put in the cloud and still be compliant, the answer is usually more than you thought. I talked, for example, an IT leader at a French bank in Paris recently, who told me his bank had done this enormous survey, checking all their data, and the result they found was that legally in France, a tough environment, they were able to put 80% of their data in the cloud. So these are issues. Be aware of them, but I encourage not to let them be a showstopper. One more thing. Americans probably not so much. If you're European, as some of you are, I'm sure, there are now two words in your head. Those two words are Edward and Snowden, right? Americans are less bugged about this, in my experience, but Europeans are very upset about the Snowden revelations. Let me tell you my perspective. First of all, remember, I'm not Microsoft. I don't work for Microsoft. It's my personal opinion as a U.S. citizen. When I first read about the Snowden revelations, about all the diverse spying, I was disappointed. What I was not, however, was surprised. Who in the room was surprised about the Snowden revelations? Really surprised? I see no hands. All right, great. So before Snowden, we all thought they were spying on us. After Snowden, we know for sure. What's the difference? I don't see much change in behavior post-Snowden, personally. I really don't, even in Europe. So, all right. It may seem odd to start a talk on Azure with objections, but those are all in people's minds. You've got to address them right up front. So, here comes the world's shortest Azure tutorial. You don't need to know much about the technology to grasp the core scenarios you might use in Azure as an enterprise getting going in this space. So, for compute, there are a couple of options for running your applications. The most commonly used is in a category known as IaaS. Across cloud platforms and elsewhere, this term is used, infrastructure as a service. Americans pronounce the acronym IaaS. Europeans will say EaaS. So I'm going to say I as an American. The idea here is that you go to a website, they call it a portal, it's a website. You ask for a virtual machine running Windows or Linux, and it's there for you in just a few minutes. You define the size and memory, how many cores, so on. It's there for you in memory. Okay? You can then use that VM as you see fit. When you're done, you shut it down. That's called IaaS. Turns out that IaaS is, I would argue, the most important technology in Azure today for compute. And you'll see why. Almost all of our scenarios are about IaaS, almost all of them. The alternative, though, is something that's commonly known as PaaS, Platform as a Service, PaaS when it's pronounced. Azure actually has two PaaS technologies called cloud services and websites. The idea with PaaS is this. You do not get a VM. Rather, you just say, platform, here's my application, here's my data, run them. Take care of them. PaaS is a managed environment for running an application. We'll come back to this. There are pros and cons to both. But mostly I'll discuss IaaS, because getting those raw VMs that are yours to control is what you do in most of these scenarios I'll see today. And by the way, I see folks taking pictures of my slides. You're fine to do that, but I'll send you a PDF as well, if you'd like. So, just so you know. All right. That's how you run code. Here's how you do data. A few options in Azure. Number one, surprisingly useful, is blob storage. It's kind of like a big sand in the sky. It just stores binary data. Simple, straightforward. You can also run databases in a virtual machine. SQL Server, Oracle, DB2, MySQL. Now think about that, MySQL. Can Microsoft really be serious about open source? I mean, how many times have we heard them promise to support something other than their own stuff? And those promises were, well, marketing. Not lies, marketing, okay? Didn't come true. In this case, though, it is totally coming true, and here's why. As you'll see in a moment, the way Azure charges you is based on how long your VM runs, how much storage you have. It's all usage-based. Microsoft doesn't care if that VM burns up CPU and memory through Windows or Linux. The data it creates is from Windows or Linux. You're charged the same way. The point is, Azure is not the software business for Microsoft. It is more like the hosting business. So they make money either way. They really don't care in this world. They're very strong in open source. Surprising, I know, but it's true. There's also something you might think of as kind of PaaS relational storage, managed storage in the cloud. SQL database, for example, is a managed incarnation of SQL Server to some extent. You don't get your own instance. It's a service managed for you. There are others as well, a bunch of NoSQL options, which I won't discuss here because you don't often use those as a beginner to Azure. And that was it. One more thing, and we're done with our tutorial. How do you connect your world to Microsoft's world? Well, the answer is, you've got your own data center, there's Microsoft data centers, and you can tie them together. There are two big ways to do this, most commonly used. One of them is to create a VPN connection. It's called Azure Virtual Network. It lets you have a VPN to the Azure data center. And so the servers, the virtual servers you've chosen, can have IP addresses drawn from your address space. It's a virtual private network. So you've got this thing in Azure that looks like it's on your own network. That's one option. That and many other aspects of Azure commonly are connected across the public internet. Just says across the internet, great. That can be very fine in many cases, but it's too slow and too variable in some cases. So you can also use this thing called ExpressRoute that gives you a fast, direct connection to Azure Data Center. They're not cheap, those connections, but they can be very fast, like 10 gigabits, and they give you a direct line. So, and there you have it, a complete tutorial on the main things you have to understand to grasp the main Azure scenarios for enterprises. Simple. One thing left before we talk about scenarios, and that one thing is pricing. Not always, but often, the reason you'll want to use Azure is because it will save you money. To understand why that's true in my scenarios, I've got to define the basics of Azure pricing. Turns out that Azure is full of services. I described a few of them. There are literally dozens more. There's all kinds of stuff in this technology. But again, for enterprises getting started with Azure, you don't need that stuff, usually. So I'm going to give the basics of pricing. For most people like you, there are three things that will dominate your Azure bill. The first one is what you pay for compute, for those VMs. In IaaS, virtual machines, you pay by the hour for VMs. To be precise, they're priced by the minute. The granularity is by the minute, but pricing is defined by the hour. So virtual machines, as you can see here, cost from 2 cents to $1.32 per VM per hour. The price changes based on how big the VM is, how many cores you have, and so on. You can also, from the portal, you can also say, I'd like a VM running Windows with pre-installed Dynamics AX. You can do that. Right built in to many of the images of a variety of Dynamics offerings. You can get those immediately if you want. And those cost a bit more than this, as you might imagine. So compute is a big chunk, typically, of people's bill. Other big chunk is data, where you're paying for, in some cases, just storage, other cases, functionality. So look here. SQL database, which is a managed database service I talked about a minute ago, costs from $5 for a little tiny database to almost $4,000 a month. You are paying for the power of the SQL system. You can also use just plain old blobs, which are really cheap. Look at blobs. 2 cents to 6 cents per gig per month. Really cheap. Really cheap. So it varies, the pricing varies based on what you're doing. That, however, is most often the second component, people's bills. And the third one is interesting. Bandwidth. When you send data into Azure, Microsoft says, fine, no charge for that. But when you take data out of Azure, such as an app that talks to your users, or any kind of transfer out of the Azure data centers, you get charged. You get charged. You get charged, you can see here, based on how much you send, the more you send, the less it is, and where the data center is. US and Europe are the cheapest. Asia Pac and Brazil get more expensive. So you're charged for data moved out of those data centers. Why is that? Because you're paying for those wires. The connection is more, the cost here is much more in Asia Pac and Brazil because telecoms charge more in those areas. So as we'll see later, there are a few more things you might be charged for. But the bulk of your bill in traditional enterprise scenarios is going to be compute, data/storage, and bandwidth. Okay, so I'll show you this as well. Enterprise agreements most often give you discounts on these. You won't see these prices. These are the rack rate. In an enterprise agreement or something else, you will get a lower price than this. All right, so we now know the basics of Azure. Wasn't that simple? Yeah, not too bad. Let me use these basics to walk through some scenarios. And I have grouped into two big categories, infrastructure and new apps, custom apps, because they're quite different. The folks who care are quite different as well, often. Let's start with infrastructure. I'm going to look at a bunch of scenarios here. As I said, we're going to deal with them based in part on risk. So there are scenarios for Azure such as data storage, identity, VMs on demand, which is a special case of dev test I'll show in a minute, disaster recovery, deploying packaged apps like SharePoint or Dynamics, and finally, once folks have built a lot of trust, we're seeing them move their current apps into the cloud. So there's kind of a trust gradient here. You commonly start small, build some trust, move up this list, typically. So I'm not going to suggest go to the last one tomorrow. Probably a bad idea for most people. You know, I was in Bogota, Colombia last week. I met with a company where the CIO, smart guy, was going to rebuild his business on Azure with putting all their new stuff on Azure within 9 months, starting like next month. And I said, sir, that is a bad idea. They had no Azure experience. They were going to start critical apps, their core business on Azure, like next week. Made me very nervous. Would that make you nervous? Made me nervous. Just because it's a brand new world. They don't know what they're doing yet. Start small. Is it clear I don't work for Microsoft? They would say, yes, do everything. Tell me, is my mic cutting in and out here? Yeah, I feel it's like, can we fix this, sir? Is this a whole new mic? It is, apparently.
Taking some hits.
What was that? right. Better? Yes. All right. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. One way that people often start using Azure is with blob storage. Blob storage seems so simple, and it is, but it's also really useful. It's really useful. So here are some common ways to use it. Microsoft sells this thing called Store Simple. We'll see in a moment. It's an appliance for data storage. It's worth more look. One more slide coming up. Another way to use this is for backups. Today, there's built-in support in SQL Server, in Windows Server, to do backups to Azure Blobs. And of course, any apps that want to can use this to store video or anything else, just unstructured data. Backups are useful. Another useful thing is Store Simple. Store Simple is worth a little bit more attention. It looks like this. Here's your data center, or rather your organization. You've got users. The users use applications, probably running in VMs, on your various servers. Those servers rely on data, storage, in your own data center, such as a SAN. Well, this thing called Store Simple is kind of like a SAN. It's a device, fits your data center, has disk on it, but not really very much. Because what it does is caches data and moves it around. Typically, you can change this. Typically, as data stops being used for a while, like all caches, it will flush that data out to the cloud, where it's put on blob storage. When it's asked for again, it brings it back silently. You can roll this in, hook it up in just an hour or two, and it just starts working. It's interesting. And the data put in blobs is compressed and encrypted. Okay, that's important. Encrypted. Because people have issues with trusting the cloud. With this technology, data is encrypted, and only you have the key. Microsoft doesn't. Only you have the key. So, folks start here because there's lower risk, with encryption especially, and overwhelming reason to use this is this. It's lower cost. Here's an example. Suppose that you want to store a terabyte of data in geo-redundant blobs. What does that mean? Geo-redundant means it's an option. It means that if you write data to the blob in one data center, that data will be copied to a copy of the blob in a nearby data center. Why do that? Disaster recovery. First one goes down, this one's still available. I chose that here because I am showing you the most expensive example, the highest price blobs, the highest price. You pay a tiny bit for reads and writes, operations in the data, and you pay bandwidth for data out. In this case, I'm assuming they move out half a terabyte a month. What does it look like for price? There's a summary of the storage. Here's what you get. US and Europe, about $100 a month for a terabyte of redundant data. Tell me, is that expensive? Is that cheap? It's dirt cheap, right? It's dirt cheap. That's why folks do it. I should not take questions, sorry. It pains me. It just pains me. But I really should. I've got a short time here. Afterwards, can we talk? Okay. He said it's really cheap for an enterprise customer. Yeah, right. So that's why people start here. Clear benefit, low risk with Store Simple, especially encrypts data. You can start it. People also commonly start if they have the problem with identity. Here's how this works. This is relatively new in Azure. You've got on-premises Windows Server Active Directory, right? Who in the room does not run Active Directory in their company? I see no hands. Right. I won't use the M word here, but still, let's say it's very popular technology. Okay? You can also today have your IT admin connect your on-prem Windows Server AD to this thing called Azure Active Directory. Now, don't be confused. They're actually quite different. But they both work with identity, and they're called Azure AD. Now, once you've done this, your user can log in as always. He or she is unaware of Azure stuff. They log in as always. They can now access, of course, applications that are running on premises. That's how AD works. It gives you single sign-on to apps running on premises. But they can also now access SaaS apps, cloud apps, software as a service apps, running on Azure without logging in. So you get single sign-on across, of course, your on-premises apps, like always, but also SaaS apps running on Azure. And it's better than this. It's better than this because not only does it support apps running on Azure, it supports apps running anywhere else. So out of the box, so to speak, that's a metaphor that doesn't really apply here, but nonetheless, out of the box, this thing gives you single sign-on to, well, look at this. Here's why I use this. Single sign-on to diverse SaaS applications, like, of course, Microsoft's O365, Dynamics CRM Online, but it also gives you single sign-on to things like Google Apps and Salesforce CRM and ServiceNow and Dropbox. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing this? The reason is that as the world moves more and more to SaaS applications, we run fewer things on-prem, more in the cloud. Users do not want to log in separately to all those apps. They want an AD for the cloud. Someone's going to play that role. Microsoft wants to be that someone. Azure AD, in this scenario, is analogous to Windows Server AD in that it provides single sign-on to SaaS apps across the spectrum. It's trying to be the AD of the cloud. In my opinion, they got a good chance of doing this. So we'll see. You also use this for other things. If you have lots of SaaS applications, or even a couple, you get single sign-on, you also get multi-factor authentication, which means the following. To log in, you type your password as always, but you also must enter a code sent to you on your phone, by the system, and type that number in as well. Two things to log in, something you know, something you have, number on your phone. That's really important in my opinion. Helps a lot. And you also get admin stuff. You can have, for example, self-service password resets for your SaaS apps. There's a lot to people. And you have better administration stuff as well, reports of who accessed what, so on. Lots of folks start here. Why? It solves a real problem. I've just shown them here. And it has very little risk. Because all you put, at most, all you do is put a hash of your passwords in the cloud. At most. You don't have to do this. Depends on the scenarios. But at most, you put a hash of your password in the cloud. Not very risky. And if you have this problem, very useful. Can I ask the room, who has this issue of getting single sign-on to SaaS applications today? A few of you. I promise you, a year from today, 2 years, 5 years, are all going to raise your hands. So this is the attempt to solve that for Microsoft. It's interesting. Another way people commonly start using Azure is VMs on demand, typically for a test dev environment for their developers. Looks like this. An IT admin or a developer can go to the Microsoft Azure Management Portal. That's the place you do stuff, create VMs and so on. It's a website. He uses the IaaS technology to create some nice IaaS VMs running Windows and or Linux. The dev team can then use these if they were local. Rather than building in your own environment on premises, you can use these. The app you're building can run in the cloud or on premises, either one. So lots of folks start using Azure here. Why do they do that? Here's why. It's a cheap and easy way to get relatively inexpensive VMs. Windows or Linux, you can provide your own VHD or use those that Microsoft has to build on. It's useful in lots of situations, not just dev test, but also innovation, proof of concept issues, and you can turn these things off when they're not needed. Like nights and weekends, if your devs aren't there, just turn the VMs off, stop paying. You shut a VM down, you stop paying for it. So you can use them when you need them, shut them down. Developers often like this a lot because the VMs are not locked down by their IT department. They have the passwords, developers have the passwords to the VMs, which the devs love. Central IT, not so much necessarily, but devs love it. So folks start here because it's a clear benefit, fast, easy VMs, inexpensive, and it's for dev test. For dev test, people usually don't use real data. They use test data. So regulatory concerns aren't a factor. It's just test data in the cloud. Once you have started using Azure, often, most often in my experience, one of these three scenarios, then you might move ahead. Now, some folks start further down the line. Most commonly, though, my experience, people start with this or directory or blobs. You can do things like this as well if you want to. Disaster recovery. Now, that turns out to be a big, broad phrase, encompassing a lot of different things. Here's one simple example. You've got an app running on premises using SQL Server, and you want to have disaster recovery for the database. You can do that on Azure like this. You have someone create a SQL Server instance in an IaaS VM on Azure. You then group that SQL Server instance with the on-premises one into this thing called an always-on availability group. When you do that, writes to the top database get copied to the one down below. Not atomically, but very quickly. If the on-prem database fails, use it directly to the one in the cloud. Okay? That's a simple kind of DR for databases. There's also a way to use Azure for more full-featured disaster recovery, like this. Suppose you have, in your organization, VMs in workloads, running workloads, maybe on physical machines, Hyper-V VMs, VMware VMs. With this technology called Azure Site Recovery, you can define the backup logic that you want for those VMs. When disaster happens, that logic you created is run, and all those workloads can be moved to the cloud. Notice that. Even things that were running in VMware can go to Hyper-V in the cloud. That's a brand new feature of this technology, but it's important. So this kind of backup is possible, disaster recovery, excuse me, with Azure today. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? Well, it's probably kind of obvious, isn't it? Cover a range of scenarios. I gave you two examples here. And typically, it can be much cheaper. Organizations doing DR today, often, if they're big, have a whole dedicated data center for disaster recovery, just sitting there waiting for disaster. Very expensive. In IaaS, with IaaS on Azure, you can, in some scenarios, spin up your VMs when you need them. When there's a disaster, then shut them down. You'll always have some running, probably, but you'll have the ability to have VMs spun up as needed and paid for only then. It's hard not to believe that cloud platforms will rule the disaster recovery market in just a few years. They make so much financial sense because you pay for VMs when you need them. Great. And that means you could have DR not just for your most critical apps, but for maybe all of them because it's so much cheaper. Azure Site Recovery is aimed at getting in there in the market by being broad and really inexpensive as a DR solution. And finally, there are lots of options. There's support for backup and disaster recovery in data centers around the world. Look at this last point here. Azure Site Recovery lets you fail over to Azure, as I just showed you. It also lets you fail over to a hoster or enterprise data center, a backup data center. It supports all those options. I just showed you Azure. It does more than that, however. So if you're interested in disaster recovery, I would encourage you to examine this product. It's quite new in terms of what it does. But it's useful in a bunch of scenarios. What next? Deploying packaged apps, like SharePoint. Here I've shown a connection between on-prem data center and Azure with the virtual network that creates a VPN, remember. I'm also showing something else. Don't be confused by this. Active Directory, Windows Server AD, is running on premises. In a VM in Azure, you can also run Windows Server Active Directory. Don't be confused. This is not Azure AD. It's a copy of Windows Server AD running in a VM on Azure, which you can do. And it makes really good sense sometimes. So for example, if I want to deploy SharePoint, a new SharePoint farm, I can just create the VMs, deploy SharePoint in those VMs, and let users access the farm. They won't know the difference. Why would I do this? Why do this? The most common reason I have seen for business units to use Azure to deploy packaged apps is the following. It is that they can get around their own IT department. You go to IT, you say, I want a new SharePoint farm. IT says, yes, absolutely, in roughly 6 to 8 months. And you say, well, no, I want it right now. So with Azure, the VMs are there in 5 minutes, start deploying right now. That's the most common reason I have seen for why people deploy packaged apps on Azure. Now, I know some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, okay, they go around central IT, you're thinking, but I am central IT. Right? I hate this idea. Right? Yeah, well, here's the thing. Welcome to more shadow IT, because you just can't stop this. Even if your CIO, maybe that's you, is a graduate of the Joseph Stalin School of IT Management, you can't stop this, because the business will just do it. Your best approach is to try to get them to go through you first, to say, you know what, we can't do this 6 to 8 months, but we'll help you use Azure. Because otherwise, the business will go off all over the world and choose lots of different technologies and so on. So to be a concierge, to help them use the cloud, is a much better approach, in my experience, than to say, no, you can't do this, because you will lose that battle. Ultimately, we work for them, right? We support them. So they always win. So you can't stop them. It's better to help them in a coherent way. Also, when you start running things in the cloud, you have these monthly bills, which makes IT expenses into an operating rather than capital expense. Now, there are some CFOs who love this. There are some CFOs who hate this. But it's what happens when you go to the cloud. It's operating, not capital. And look at this, lower cost. I would suggest that probably today, Azure costs less than your own data center. It probably does, but it might not. It might not. As we'll discuss later, it's actually often hard to know. But I promise you that in 5 years, Azure will cost way less than your data center. And you know why? Because in this public cloud market, there are 3 major players: Azure, Amazon, and Google. Maybe you're thinking, what about IBM? IBM is here too. They don't have a prayer, in my opinion. They're not a big player. The winners are going to be Azure, Amazon, and Google. You know why? Because only they have the massive scale required to compare price-wise. Because here's what happens. The core things sold today by Azure, Amazon, Google are IaaS VMs and blob storage. Those are the big, high-dollar technologies. And they're very similar across all 3 of the providers. It's almost like selling commodities. When you have 3 giant players selling very similar offerings, what happens to prices? Answer, they drop to the cost of the goods eventually. And so we're seeing costs of Azure data centers go down, 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 down all the time. Why? Competition. Google will cut, Microsoft and Amazon will match. Amazon cuts, Google and Microsoft match. Microsoft cuts, other guys match. It's going down like this, down, down, down. Good for you. We're going to see prices and costs in public cloud data centers within just a few years that almost nobody can beat their own data center. Because these guys, Microsoft Azure, for example, have massive scale, almost no, it's all automated. They can do things much more cheaply. You know, there's an analogy that's often made. I didn't invent this analogy, but it's interesting. Here's what it is. In the late 1800s, 19th century, factories began to electrify, to have motors, electric motors running their stuff rather than something else. But to do this, the factories all had to have their own generator, create electricity. Over a while, people said, well, wait a minute. Why don't we just have one big generator that we all share and use that guy's electricity? Took a while. The trust issues were there. It was far away. But eventually, these manufacturing companies realized they did not want to run generators. It's not their core business. We began to trust the remote ones, and now we have utilities. Today, a factory doesn't have their own generators, clearly. There is a clear analogy here with computing. Whatever business you're in, I suspect that your CEO does not like writing checks for data centers. If they can have that stuff done outside, as things move toward big utilities like Azure, as we learn to trust them, it is wholly plausible, I think, that we're not going to see the same kind of IT data centers on premises over time. Startups today all just use cloud stuff all the time. Data centers are just retro to them. So, over time, I think we're likely to see that same thing emerging, with the big utilities being Microsoft, maybe Amazon, maybe Google, who knows? Who agrees with me? Who thinks that's also true? Yeah, a lot of you, okay. It's kind of scary, isn't it? If you're an IT guy, what does it mean for your career? Well, if you're an IT person who just rolls in servers and plugs them together and so on, you got to learn new things. If you're an Exchange admin, you've got about 3 years before your job goes away. Exchange is going very rapidly to the cloud. That's my opinion. It's going fast to the cloud. If you're an IT leader, what does that mean? It means that over time, probably, you're going to have less on-premises stuff and more cloud stuff, and probably somewhat fewer staff. But you'll still have a job, clearly. A lot of guys talk to me and say, but David, I'm so scared about this. What's happening to my job? Anybody who believed that their current skill set would last their whole career was wrong. People who don't like change should not work in technology. It's the nature of our business. All right, end of tirade. One more scenario here. Oh, look at this. I've said this. You can deploy Dynamics apps as well in these VMs. You can get them prepackaged in the VMs or deploy them yourself if you want to. So that certainly works. And finally, when people have real trust in Azure, they'll do this. They'll create IaaS VMs and move their on-prem apps to the cloud. Users don't care. Why do this? Well, I've just told you. It's really about cost to some extent. Here's an example. I've got a smallish app that runs in 2 small VMs, medium VMs, sorry, 80 cents an hour. It's got a small database. I'm assuming some data transfer and so on. The pricing works out like this, and here's the total. To run this app is about $280 a month. Now I ask you, is that expensive? Is that cheap? For most of you, I know the answer. The answer is, I don't know, because nobody measures their costs this way. So it's a good thing to start thinking about your costs in these terms, perhaps, and thinking about putting things in Azure. You've got to compare apples to apples. People will say, but wait a minute, I can buy a whole server for what it costs me to run this for a year. I can buy a whole server. How could this be cheaper? Because they're not taking the fully burdened cost of managing the server, of power, of data center space, of cooling. Compare apples to apples. In my experience, when you ask IT guys for costs, they will lie to you. Right? They will lie to you because they're worried about their jobs to some degree. But apples to apples is the right thing to do, and that can be hard. If today you do this and you find that Azure is not cheaper, we'll come back next year. Prices are dropping all the time. And there you have it, a quick walkthrough of infrastructure scenarios. And I discussed a bit the order in which they're commonly adopted. Not always, but commonly. The first 3 are the most usual place to dip your toe into Azure. Our last section here, we got about 50 minutes left, applications. So we'll discuss a few categories. There are lots of ways to categorize custom applications. Here's how I want to do it. There are apps that face inward towards your employees. There are apps that face outward towards your customers. And there are, in their own category, I think, parallel apps, which are uniquely cool for cloud platforms. Let's start with employee-facing applications. Suppose you want to build a new app for your employees. I don't know, benefits management, whatever, some internally facing new app, something that optimizes the business process internally. What can you do? Create the VMs and run the app in IaaS VMs. The customers don't care. Rather than on-prem, build a new app in IaaS VMs. They're just like ordinary VMs with Windows and Linux and so on. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? It's fast and speedy. You have to wait for IT, once again. You go around central IT. People like this for that reason, in many cases. There are also some things you can't get otherwise on Azure. For example, with Azure, it's easy to scale. If you need more VMs for more users, you can just create them, even automatically. When the big load goes away, you just cut them down. You pay for what you need. That kind of scalability is great for apps that have big peaks and then drops. Useful. And Again, lower cost. Maybe not today, depends on your data center, but probably today and certainly tomorrow. You could also build your employee-facing application not using IaaS, but this thing called PaaS I discussed earlier. Remember what PaaS is? It's a managed environment where you just say, here is my app, here is my data, take care of it for me, run this thing. Okay? Why use PaaS over IaaS? Why use PaaS over IaaS? Well, one big reason is it's faster. There's less work for your devs to do. They can just build the app right on the platform, start running. Super. There's also less management work because the PaaS platform manages itself to a great degree. And since developers have less to do, less management work to do, you wind up with fewer ways to screw up. And so there's less risk in this as well. I got to tell you, if you're new to this, developers have some kind of, I don't know, almost a holy war about IaaS versus PaaS. Many organizations, many people are just massive PaaS fans. Microsoft, big PaaS orientation. But many developers, in my experience, don't like PaaS. And the reason is it gives them a very easy way to build things, but they can't do low-level stuff. It limits you somewhat. And developers aren't always crazy about that. A friend of mine, David Platt, points out that in America, most of us drive automatic transmissions, right? Automatics. But the big group driving stick shifts is developers because they want control over their machine. Yeah, good analogy. And it's true here, I think, that some folks like PaaS, some folks like IaaS. I have no opinion. Pick what you like. Both have pros and cons. All right. Now, how about an app facing customers? Well, here, I'm going to show a diagram of building a PaaS app that talks to people on the internet. Why would you do this? Why build an app for your customers on Azure? There are some really good reasons. The first of which is massive scale. If you want to build an application that can be accessed by your customers, and you might have 5, 10, 20,000 online at once, you want the scale a public cloud platform provides for you, for sure, for sure. You also get the scaling I mentioned before, handling spiky applications, high reliability, and so on. There's a bunch of stuff in a public cloud platform like Azure that's really hard to do in your own data center. It's really hard. Probably it's going to cost you less, and deployment's going to be faster and easier with PaaS. There is, I think, more to say here, because there are certain kinds of applications, certain scenarios, where when you hear these, you should say, oh yeah, that's a good Azure app. So for example, if you see an application you're going to build where you want fast access to computing resources with no commitment. Examples? A marketing website where you're going to put up a marketing campaign and it might last for 2 years if it's a big hit. It might last for 2 months if it's not. You want to start right now. Great Azure scenario. Start running VMs. If it's a big hit, run more. If it fails, shut them down. It's a great way to do it. Fast, no commitment of resources. Classic Azure application. I said earlier, if you require massive global scale, consumer web applications, that is a great example of when you want to use technology like Azure because of the scale, the replication, all those things. An app that has very spiky usage, like online ticket sales. Imagine you are a company that sells tickets to sporting events and concerts and so on. You sell tickets for, I don't know, Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift, somebody, Mumford & Sons. And there's this enormous spike until they sell out. Then it drops down again. That's a great Azure scenario because for the spike, you got a bunch of VMs you're paying for. When it's over, shut them down and stop paying. Makes sense. Running applications on premises can raise security issues. People sometimes build apps on Azure because it is not less, it is more secure. What's an example? A classic case I've seen is this, a mobile app. If you're in a utility, power company, you want to give your customers apps on their phones, let them use their own usage. Good idea. Except the guys running the data center are going to say, wait, I'm going to let customer phones through my firewall into my enterprise data center? I don't think so. So instead, they build the app back in on Azure, move data back and forth as needed. So I've seen that quite a bit, actually. And one more example, people who don't want in-house IT. They don't want data centers at all. Who is that? Well, startups, for sure. And I would say progressive businesses. As most of you agreed earlier, the world's going this way. And so we've got to deal with it. I would argue the move to cloud computing is at least as big as the change from mainframes to client server was back in the 90s. Most of you remember that. You're far too young, right? But I do. And so that was a huge thing. This is at least that big for IT. All right, one last scenario here. Parallel apps, which are a wonderful, wonderful fit for cloud platforms. Parallel means you've got lots of VMs, in this case, running at once to solve your problem. And the problem is spread across those VMs. There are two big categories today of parallel apps. In one case, what you want is lots of CPU power. What's an example? Simulation of a bond portfolio performance or an explosion or whatever, okay? That's commonly called HPC, high performance computing. On Azure, you can do that like this. There is this thing called the HPC pack that can run with Windows Server. Through that, you can say, please create for me a cluster of VMs on Azure. 5, 10, 20, 30 if you want, 100 if you want. Then you give it your job, your application to run, and the thing runs in parallel across all those VMs. Get your result, and you're done. Why is that cool? It's cool because simulations, other kinds of parallel applications, can be really valuable, really useful. But without Azure, you've got to buy a bunch of physical machines and maintain them. Who can do this? Big companies. Very expensive. With this, start the VMs, let them run as long as you need them, shut them down. Much cheaper. This democratizes access to the power of HPC. Anybody can now use it. Big change, really important. That value is also true for a second category of parallel applications, which is commonly called big data. Here, you want to have a bunch of VMs to process a lot of data simultaneously. I'm trying to get computer power, CPU power. You want to access lots of data, lots of disk drives, lots of spindles. So on Azure, there is something called HD Insight, which is to create a cluster for big data. What is HD Insight? It's Hadoop. Our industry has settled on Hadoop as the big data solution. That guy implements Hadoop for you. You can then run your job, such as a MapReduce job. You get the results. Okay. Why would you do this? Well, the same reason. I can spin up those VMs for a big data problem, pay when they're used, then shut them down. It makes this so much cheaper. It also lets you avoid the challenge of managing a Hadoop cluster yourself. Azure does it for you. Managing Hadoop clusters is not simple. So here, the technology does it for you. I said all these things. So, there you have it. A quick survey of the kinds of apps you might build on Azure and why you would do it. So we're done. I began this talk by asserting that public cloud platforms have value for almost everybody. I've talked about this stuff. My experience is this. At least one of these scenarios has value for most organizations today. Let me ask the room. Who in this room thinks that at least one scenario I've talked about today has value for your organization? At least one. Ooh. Do you know what? I've done this talk around the world, probably 1,000 people by now. End of the talk, I always ask this question. Every city, every country, every time, I see almost all the hands. That is why I believe what I showed you at the start, that this guy has value for everybody. Let me ask again, for whom is it storage, blob storage, things like that? A bunch of you, great. For who is it maybe Active Directory? Maybe, okay, ooh. Outside the US, you don't get this very much. It's interesting. For who is it test dev on VMs? Ooh, almost all of you. Anything else? Okay.
We're actually moving business apps.
Are you starting with that?
We are starting with it with a major partner.
They're starting with a major partner, actually moving the business apps to Azure. That's a rare place to start in my experience, but more power to you. There's a reason for it. You can't tell me. Okay, great.
The thing that's probably most appealing to me, you didn't mention it a lot in the presentation, is the speed. You mentioned it, but what we're after is, it takes us so long to stand up any other infrastructure. So what we're after is, I can turn it on, I can stand it up, I can have time to value much faster than if I use my internal.
His comment is you can get VMs much faster on Azure, like 5 minutes, than getting them in your own environment. Yes, but you want those VMs for things like building apps or deploying things. So arguably that's a subset of what I talked about, but yes, that's great to know. Thank you. Yes?
Business continuity, such as replicating physical servers up to Azure for failover.
Okay.
Although I have had one issue crop up in that, and Azure does not support email applications, including Exchange,
Right. His comment here is
which is a very big issue.
he's using Azure to have backups in the cloud for on-premises things. Makes sense. But Azure does not support Exchange.
Or any other email application.
Well, any other is arguable. I've never seen people try it.
SMTP is what they tell me to log.
But Exchange is emphatically not used on Azure. Why? You know why. Exchange Online. Right? That's their strategy going forward. So why help you go to something that's not the right way forward? Yes, sir, in the back.
All this is great, but if we can't get to it, we have a problem. We have about 5 dozen operations that are in remote areas, and the best way I can get is 1.5 megabits. So it tips the balance when I have to go to a company to triple or quadruple my bandwidth to get to the
Right. Right. His comment is, I got to speak for the recording here. His comment is that if there's not enough bandwidth, if you're in some fairly remote area, it's difficult to use this. And so the cost might be pumped up a huge amount by needing to get better bandwidth. Yeah. So I travel around the world, I find that a lot in smaller places. Philippines, in Colombia last week, that was an issue, South America. Yeah. In the US and Europe, I rarely see it. But outside those areas, you can have this bandwidth issue. You're exactly right. I've seen it too. So this is not a panacea. It's not a solution for all problems, but it is for a lot of them. And I believe in my heart it's where we're going. So one last thing here. All of you, almost all of you, raised your hands when I asked you if the scenarios are useful. You almost all raised your hands. So my final thought, my final question to you is this. What are you waiting for? Thank you very much.